It had been a month since I moved into the old Victorian house at the end of Willow Street. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. But the price was right, and the house needed little work. My name's Tom, by the way. I'm a writer. Or at least, I try to be. So the isolation suited me just fine. My first few days were spent unpacking boxes and familiarizing myself with the creaks and groans of my new home. The house was old, built in the late 1800s, but it had good bones. It was only when I started exploring the neighborhood that I noticed something odd. Every house had a well-tended garden, neatly trimmed lawns, and welcoming porches, except for one. The house next door stood out like a sore thumb. Its once white paint was faded and chipped, the yard overgrown with weeds, and the windows seemed to stare blankly at me, their curtains never moving. Curiosity piqued. I knocked on the neighbor's door one afternoon. After several minutes of waiting, I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I cupped my hands around my face and peered through the window. The inside was dimly lit, but I could make out a room filled with old furniture draped in dusty sheets. As I turned to leave, Diane, an elderly woman from across the street, called out to me. "You won't get any answer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hasn't left that house in over 30 years. I raised an eyebrow. "Who's he?" Diane leaned in closer, as if sharing a secret. "Frank. He moved in around 30 years ago, only he never left. We don't know what he does in there, but we mind our own business. It's safer that way." I felt a chill run down my spine, not from her words, but from the genuine fear in her eyes. I thanked her for the information and retreated back to my house, determined to learn more about Frank. That night, as I sat at my desk trying to write, I found myself distracted by the house next door. The curtains were still drawn, giving no hint of life inside. I decided then that I would find out what was going on. The following day, I gathered my courage and approached the old man's house again. This time, I didn't knock on the front door. Instead, I walked around the side, looking for an open window or a loose board. The yard was choked with weeds, and the air felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. I found what I was looking for at the back of the house, a small window leading into the attic, slightly ajar. With a quick glance around to ensure no prying eyes were watching, I slipped inside. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and yellowed trinkets gathering dust. I could hear the faint scratching of mice and the hum of distant traffic, but nothing else. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I noticed a narrow staircase leading down into the house proper. I took a deep breath and started to descend. The interior of Frank's house was like stepping back in time. Every room was filled with antique furniture, old newspapers yellowed with age, and books gathering dust on shelves. It felt abandoned, but not quite empty. There was an almost tangible sense that someone had just stepped out for a moment and would be returning any second. I wandered through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I found myself in the kitchen, where the table was set with a single plate, fork, knife, and glass, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The sink contained a few dishes, also caked with grime. It looked like they hadn't been used in years. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the windowsill sat a small, framed photograph. It showed a man standing in front of this very house, smiling at the camera. Behind him, the yard was tidy, the paint on the house fresh and white. The man in the photograph was Frank. But there was something else too, something that made my heart skip a beat. In the reflection of the window behind him, I could see another figure standing just outside the frame. A figure with no face, only darkness where features should be. Over the next few weeks, I found myself becoming obsessed with Frank and his house. I spent hours poring over old newspaper articles, trying to find any mention of him, but it was as if he had simply dropped off the face of the earth. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sun set, I noticed a light flickering in Frank's attic window. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that something, was moving around up there. I considered going next door and confronting whoever it was, but fear rooted me to my seat. The light went out after a few minutes, leaving the house dark once more. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But as I turned to go inside, I noticed something on my doorstep. It was an envelope, yellowed with age and addressed in spidery handwriting. To the new neighbor. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a single piece of paper filled with neat, old-fashioned script. Dear neighbor, I see you've been watching me. I suppose it's only fair that I return the favor. Come to dinner this Friday at 7 p.m. We have much to discuss. Yours sincerely, Frank. The letter was signed with a flourish, the ink smudged as if it had been written in haste. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what this could mean. Was Frank still alive? And if so, why hadn't he left his house in all these years? I knew I should refuse the invitation, but curiosity gnawed at me like a rat. I found myself standing in front of my mirror, practicing what I would say when I accepted, because I already knew I wouldn't turn him down. The night of the dinner arrived, and with it, a thick fog that seemed to muffle all sound. I walked next door, my footsteps swallowed by the damp ground, feeling as if I was being watched from every shadow. The house loomed before me, its windows glowing with an eerie yellow light. I knocked on the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. After a moment, the door creaked open to reveal Frank standing there, smiling at me like a long-lost friend. He looked exactly as he did in the photograph, mid-50s, with sharp blue eyes and silver hair neatly combed back. "Ah, you made it," he said, his voice surprisingly strong and clear. "I was beginning to think you'd stand me up." He led me inside, chattering away about the weather and my new home as if we were old acquaintances. The interior of the house was different now, cleaner, brighter, filled with the smell of cooking food. We sat down at a table set for two, Frank taking his seat at the head. As he began to serve the meal, I noticed something strange about him. His hands trembled slightly, and there were dark circles under his eyes that seemed almost bruised. But when he caught me looking, he smiled warmly, and I felt foolish for thinking anything was amiss. We ate in silence for a few minutes before Frank spoke up again. "I suppose you're wondering why I haven't left this house in so long," he said, pushing his food around on his plate. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's a long story, but I'll try to make it brief. You see, when I moved into this house all those years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I invited something inside with me, something that doesn't want to let me go." My blood ran cold as he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's here now, in this room with us. It always is. And it's waiting for you to leave so it can have you all to itself." I looked around the room, expecting to see some monstrous creature lurking in the corners. But there was nothing. Only the flickering light of the candles, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Frank leaned across the table, his eyes wide and desperate. "You must leave this house immediately," he hissed. "Lock your doors and never come back. And whatever you do, don't let it inside." As if on cue, a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. When I lit a match, I found Frank slumped over the table, his face pale and lifeless. I stumbled out of the house, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached my own front door, I glanced back at Frank's house. In one of the upstairs windows, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. To this day, I don't know what truly happened that night. Was Frank mad? Or had he been telling the truth about something lurking in his house? All I know is that I never set foot inside that place again. And whenever I look out my window at the old Victorian next door, I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone.